class. But I am also hoping to broaden it a little bit to some of the areas that you all work in through our conversation, because certainly microaggressions are present, throughout all of our professions and in all of the spheres in which we operate, both professionally and personally. So this is a really widely applicable topic, and certainly one that I really enjoy teaching and kind of making people more aware of. So I will share my screen. I put together a PowerPoint. I'm also happy to share this. And I'll just be noting a lot of the kind of academic definitions and things that I'll be using today are taken from two of the leading researchers in this area in the counseling world, at least Sue and Sue, Daryl Sue and David Sue, who have authored a lot of textbooks and done a lot of research, particularly around microaggressions and their impact on people. So let me share my screen. Oh, geez, I always do this to myself where I have like 17 windows open, right? And so I'm like, which one do I choose? Here, show all windows. And there we go. Okay. You all see the PowerPoint now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, correct. Okay, so we're going to be talking today about recognizing and addressing, or thinking about how to address at least microaggressions in the classroom and community. And so I'm going to start off with a video clip from Grey's Anatomy. Some of you may be familiar with that show. And as I mentioned, with these microaggressions, we really see them everywhere. So this is one example that we'll just start with, and I just like you to watch it and kind of observe and take note of some of the things that the characters discuss in relation to this topic. Oh, okay, let's see if this works. I have this queued up also without the ad, but I'm just going to keep it in this window so it doesn't screw up the sharing.
I don't see your video.
Oh no.
It's still on your slides.
Still on the slide? Okay, let me try. All right, that's good to know. Apologies for the technical. Here, maybe I have to share my other screen. Just bear with me one moment. Does that look better?
Yes.
Okay.
Hey, Jess. Hey, Jess. I can't really hear the volume. Can anybody hear that?
I can't hear either. There must be an option to give like computer voice.
Okay, hold on one sec. Let's see if I can find it. If not, we'll just skip over this one and kind of keep going. Let me see.
If you share make sure you're sharing your sound under your share screen.
I'm not. All right, let me try one more thing. If not, I will just. Okay. I think I found what I was missing here. Let's try this one more time. Thank you for the tip there, Jennifer.
Anything to you, Riggs?
Yeah.
I don't know, smart, capable, charming. Ugh. I think Bailey was right. Owen wouldn't tell you anything.
He just shut me out. I don't know why. And then I'm afraid I might have been racist. God, I hate this day.
Okay, back it up.
Oh, good. I can talk to you about this. I am worried I offended Edwards. I need you to tell me.
Why me? Because I'm your sister?
Yes?
Or because I'm your sister?
No, this is exactly what I was worried about. Okay.
What do you think you did?
I don't think I did anything, but I think she thinks I did.
Amelia, use your words. Did what?
Sided with Wilson over her because she's black, which I didn't do. I think, God, I hate that this is even an issue all of a sudden.
Well, it's not an issue for you. And it's not all of a sudden. I mean, okay, it's not Mississippi burning or anything, but it is all over. It's when people assume I'm a nurse. And they tell me that they're not boarding coach yet. It's like a low buzz in the background, and sometimes you don't even notice it, and sometimes it's loud and annoying, and sometimes it can get dangerous, and sometimes it is ridiculous, like right now.
It's funny. I mean, if I'm doing it and I don't even notice it,
Then notice it. Look, did Edwards tell you that she's okay?
yes.
Okay. Then don't.
Right. Okay, but how do I know that she's real?
Because she knows you. Okay? So listen to the words that are coming out of her mouth and believe them. This is not a small thing. And I'm glad that you feel like you can talk to me about it, but I don't speak for all black people. I am not the spokeswoman. No one is. And it is kind of annoying to be asked questions like I am. But one piece of advice that I can give you that I think we would all agree with is that if you feel uncomfortable having done it, check your white privilege and don't do it again. But I don't think you're racist.
You don't think?
Girl, get in the car.
All right, let me close that out. Let me just close this window. Okay. So what were some of the things that so this was an interaction between coworkers, for those of you not familiar with the show. What were some of the things that you maybe noticed that might relate to the topic of microaggressions? So they're talking about this interaction. Yeah, I can certainly post the link. Sorry, I just saw that in the chat. What did someone notice that was kind of linked to this topic we're exploring today?
I can say
Sure.
something. So, and I think I don't remember her name in the show. That the African American lady said, "You can't just ask me. I think I know all the all the black people issue, because that's kind of how I feel. Everybody love to ask me, do I know someone who is an Asian? I don't know all the Asian in the world. Yeah. So
yes. So some forms of microaggressions there are a couple forms of microaggressions that might be present in this clip, right? One of them is that idea of kind of asking someone to speak on behalf of their group, right? Or somehow to kind of represent their group. Which I think is one of those ones, and we're going to see this theme with this topic today, that is often done with good intentions, right? Where someone's trying to kind of ascertain a more diverse perspective, but it's problematic to ask someone to be the representative, right? Or to somehow speak on behalf of their group. Okay. And then I think, Yelling, you touched on another one, right? Which is kind of the assumption that maybe people with a similar characteristic or background, like automatically know one another, right? Or are automatically connected just based on that shared identity. Other things that stuck out to people? Well, one of the things I'll note that you'll see reiterated here is that the white character, at least appears to be white, at least in this clip, feels that something happened, right? That was uncomfortable, but she's not really clear on exactly what that is or how to address it or how to navigate it, right? And I think the thing about microaggressions, and I'll define that term more explicitly in just 1 minute, is that they're often very subtle, right? And they're often occurring in situations where people maybe feel like something's happened that wasn't quite comfortable or wasn't quite right, but they might not always be able to put their finger on it or kind of fully understand without further exploration why what was said or did or done or even perhaps the environment was not inclusive or not appropriate for all people within it. All right. All right, so let me share the PowerPoint again. And all right, so in terms of defining microaggressions, I've included a couple different definitions here. These are both from Sue and colleagues. The first one from the most recent edition of their counseling text, Counseling the Culturally Diverse. And then that second bullet is a paraphrase of a previous definition they used, but I think both of them are useful in kind of understanding this concept. So when we think about microaggressions, we're talking about these brief interactions that send a negative message about a particular group. Okay? And we typically think about them as our more marginalized identities. So people of color, LGBT plus people, people with disabilities, women, etc. But really microaggressions can occur around any aspect of our identity. Right? And so as that first quote from Sue and colleagues demonstrates, these are everyday occurrences, right? They might be direct insults or behaviors, but they can also be words or actions that invalidate the experience of others, right? Kind of diminish or deny their lived experience, right? And also important to note here is that these are often perpetrated by well-intentioned people, right? Oftentimes microaggressions occur in situations where the perpetrator is not intending to be offensive or to do harm, but yet their actions and words still have this negative impact. Okay. And then another key component of that definition is the lack of awareness, right? Sometimes when microaggressions occur, the person who has engaged in them may not even be aware that anything problematic has occurred, right? Or certainly maybe underaware of how their words and actions are affecting people. So a couple of characteristics are also included on this slide. Microaggressions can occur in a whole wide variety of ways. They certainly can be verbal, right? Words that people say to one another. They can be more behavioral. They can be nonverbal, like facial expressions, body language, etc. They can also be more visual and communicated through environments. Okay, and so I'm gonna skip down to the last bullet too here. They can be conveyed in physical spaces that somehow convey a message that only certain people are welcome or included or safe. Okay? I'll give you a couple of examples of that. One of the ones that I encourage my students to think about for their future careers is things like artwork and literature in their counseling settings. Right? If we have artwork in a setting, particularly that which includes human characters, right? We want to think about if there are any subtle messages conveyed in that. So for example, if we have paintings in a waiting room or, some kind of prints and all the individuals depicted are white, right? That conveys a particular message. Right? If it's a, family counseling or family medical practice type of a setting, and there are pictures of families on the wall, and they're all heteronormative families, right? Again, that conveys a particular message about who is welcome and included in that space. Similarly, the types of magazines or literature present, right? Again, can convey these subtle messages of both who is welcome, and who is included. And people from marginalized identities often look for these signs in the environment about how safe the space is. Okay? I can actually, as I'm looking around my office, I can give you a couple of examples, right? I have these things like this on my own desk, safe zone pin and a Black Lives Matter button, right? So anybody who walks into my office gets certain messages about what kind of space this is just from objects that are in the environment around me. Makes sense. And then, as I mentioned, oftentimes these are very subtle and they can occur without conscious awareness. Okay? And so I'll just say, as we start to explore these in more depth, it's possible that today you may recognize areas in your own life where perhaps you have perpetrated microaggressions and not even been aware that there was anything, difficult that was happening, right? I would encourage you to, if that does occur, just kind of use that as a growth opportunity, right? And in a paraphrase of the very famous Maya Angelou, right? When we know better, then we can do better. Okay? And I'll give you a personal example, right? So I grew up with people around me using the word gypped, getting gypped. I don't know if anyone's heard this phrase, right? And in my formative years, right, this phrase was used around me sometimes to kind of mean getting ripped off or cheated or those kinds of things, right? I don't think I ever saw this word in print. And if you had asked me, I would have likely spelled it J-I-P, okay? How many people are familiar with this term? Just kind of curious. Heard this in your life? Okay, a couple. All right, so like I said, I had most heard it like colloquially, never really, in a book or anything like that. And so I was at I don't think I said it very often, but it's certainly part of my vocabulary. And then I was at some kind of a diversity training conference during my master's program at the University of Buffalo. And this phrase was referenced. And much to my surprise, I found out that actually refers to gypsies. And it's spelled J-Y-P. And it's this historical term that was used based on the stereotype that people with that cultural identity are, cheat and swindle and rob people, etc. But before that, I had no awareness that it was associated with any type of identity group, right? And so until that moment, I was kind of walking around using that, like I said, sporadically, but nonetheless, having no idea that it had any relationship to people's identity or culture, right? And so once I learned that, then I altered my use of that term. Okay. Sue and other colleagues also go on to kind of elucidate different forms of these microaggressions. And I know you'll have the recording. I'm also happy to share the PowerPoint if it's useful to people after this. And you can read through these definitions, but micro assaults, as that assault phrase implies, are most blatant of these types, where most people would perhaps view that interaction and agree that it was contains some pretty obvious form of bias, right? And so as Sue explain, there are certain situations in which these are more likely to occur. And I think it's important to recognize this. So particularly these more blatant forms of microaggressions are likely to occur in situations where people can remain anonymous, okay? Can anyone think of like what's the very most common place that we can comment about things and be anonymous?
Social media?
Yep, on the internet, right? So that's like one of the big things is online, right? We might be more likely to see some of these beliefs, questionable beliefs expressed more openly, right? Because there's not that immediate interpersonal repercussions, right, of expressing those. And people can do it in a way that isn't necessarily linked back to them. Other instances that Sue describe when we might see these more blatant forms of microaggression are when the person perceives themselves to be around other people with similar beliefs, right? So when they feel like the people around them are gonna agree. And the last instance where this is most likely to occur is when people lose control of their emotions. So when they're really upset or angry or that kind of thing, they might be less likely to temper those beliefs. Okay. So the last two are the ones that we're going to focus a little bit more on today, and where I think there's the most opportunity for awareness and education to perhaps make a difference for people, right? So micro insult and micro invalidation. These are the ones that are most likely unintentional. Okay. So micro insult are those comments or behaviors that convey a negative message about a particular aspect of identity. And these are usually less obvious. Instead, there may be kind of a hidden negative message in what is conveyed. Okay. Micro-invalidation are those comments or behaviors that deny or minimize the experience of a particular group. Okay. And again, these are typically unintentional. So I'm going to go through a few examples of these microaggressions. And as I do this, I want you to just be thinking about examples in your own life or ways in which maybe you've experienced these or witnessed these. And I'm going to ask you about that later. So the first form or example that students will give us is this idea of alien in their own land. And this is when people are assumed to be non-American or foreign based on usually some aspect of their physical appearance. Okay. And so this could include comments like, where are you from? Right. And then when the person perhaps says, I don't know, Buffalo, it's like, but where are you really from? Right. So there's this implication of like, well, you're not really American. Okay. It can also come in the form of what might be assumed to be complimentary comments that are not received in a complimentary way. So if I were to say to Yaling, for example, like, oh, Yaling, you speak very good English, right? The person may think they're saying something complimentary, but that's not necessarily how it's received, right? The second example is ascription of intelligence. So making that association between some aspect of the person's identity and their intellectual ability. Okay? And again, sometimes this is done in a more subtle way. So I got some interesting comments that I would say fall under this when I was teaching statistics as a woman. Like sometimes I would get this, like, you teach statistics? Right? And I just kind of wondered what that was about. Okay. Sometimes we see this in terms of stereotypes for people from Asian descent being really good at math, right? Some of those types of examples. The third form of microaggression that students will outline is colorblindness. This is one that I think is very common and is often done with really good intentions. But a phrase that captures this is, when I look at you, I don't see color. Right? Or I don't judge people by their appearance. I judge them by who they are inside. Okay. Great intentions, right? Very idealistic type of statement, but it's just not true, right? When we look at someone, if we have the visual capability, of course, right? We see them, we see their physical appearance, and we cannot, in essence, kind of control our own stereotypes and assumptions because those are based on years of cultural conditioning. The other thing that's really problematic about that type of a phrase, although it sounds good on the surface, right? I don't see your color, I just see you as a person, is that it really negates the person's experience that is linked to their identity, right? And so my best example of this was a speaker I saw a few years ago here on campus, who was an African-American woman, and she was talking about identity and touched on this idea of microaggressions. And she said, people say this to me all the time. I don't see your color. I just see your, how wonderful you are and who you are as a person. And she said, when I hear that, what I really hear is that you don't see me, because my experience as an African-American woman is really what has, impacted my life. And so if you don't see that about me, then you don't really see who I am. And then the final one on this side is, is criminality, or the assumption of criminality. Okay? And so this would be, the assumption that particular groups are somehow more dangerous, right, or deviant based on that aspect of their identity. Okay? We sometimes see this in character stigmatizations of good and bad neighborhoods, or people being kind of nervous, perhaps holding their purse or their wallet more closely, for example, in around more diverse people that they feel less safe around. Okay. Another example that is reported pretty frequently by people of color in this country is being followed when they're shopping. So again, the assumption, sometimes this happens with young people as well. I know my students usually bring that up when I teach this one, right? But the assumption that certain groups of people maybe are more likely to shoplift, right? Or are more likely to engage in some form of crime. Okay, a few more examples here. Use of sexist or heterosexist language. And so again, terms that exclude certain groups or send that negative message, okay? One that is fairly common in our culture that I think I have made an effort to move away from is using terms like ladies and gentlemen, right? Or things like that that are in the gender binary, or, boys and girls, right? Those kinds of things. So using, instead saying, welcome everyone, right? Or that kind of thing. This could also, of course, relate to more specific derogatory language towards men and women or trans people, etc. And another place where we see this somewhat frequently in professional fields is in paperwork. Right. So I'm using a lot of examples of things people might say, but sometimes we see this within paperwork, like demographic questionnaires that people may need to complete that don't have options for everyone's identity. Denial of individual racism, sexism, or heterosexism. This is often when people are espousing that they approach their relationships with full equality and acceptance. So, saying things like, "Oh, I always treat people equally," right? Or, "I'm not a racist. I have several Black friends," right? Those kinds of statements that really deny the historical realities in our country and the fact that we are all socialized to have these certain beliefs and expectations about particular groups of people. Okay.
Hey, Jess, sorry for the
yeah.
interruption. I have
Sure.
Jeff has his hand up.
Thank you, Jeff.
Nope, I was actually, it's more of a comment. We were talking about gender. One of the things we've done at my university is remove that language in our promotion and tenure documents. And it's hard because we're so conditioned to call someone him, her, he, his, that kind of thing. And so like when I'm on the committee and we all take turns writing letters, and it sounds weird to say Dr. So-and-so like 20 times in the letter, but in order to remove, she is doing this or he is doing that, we literally, you either have to place it with they, or, you use their proper name, their last name, and their title throughout. And it does, and when you're writing things, it sounds awkward because we're not used to that. But I mean, we've really made a conscious effort to remove, those pronouns basically when we're writing letters, so that we've taken it out of all of our documents, we updated it, and we've also taken it out of our letters that we write when we're looking at someone's promotion and tenure materials each year. So I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, great example. And it does take like practice, right? And a shift in our thinking of it. Because I know as a professor, one of the things that I've had to, I used to be kind of, I don't know if anal is the right word, but I'll use that, like, very explicit about like student papers and saying, okay, if you're talking about an individual, then it needs to be he, she, right? Versus individuals, and then it's they, like some of those grammatical rules I was taught. And so shifting to the singular they was a shift for me. And I had to, kind of be okay with some of those, letting go of some of those things, or just kind of changing my approach in that way.
Right.
So yeah, and you reminded me also, Jeff, of I have a kindergartner, and there was a recent change at her school that was announced with, it was, I think, like their personnel documents, but they were changing, moving away from terms like mother and father, right, to say parent or parental. So we're seeing some of these shifts, in our systems level, which is great. But we've had a lot of that binary language present in paperwork and other processes for so long. All right. And then the final one here, and this is a big one that my students and I kind of break down, is the myth of meritocracy. Okay. AKA the American dream, right? So this is that idea that many of us are really socialized with in our upbringing, that if we just work hard enough, we can do whatever we want, right? That these characteristics of our identity don't really play a big role in our successes or failures, right? And, you know, so this is like everyone has an equal chance of getting that, you know, that job, or everyone has an equal chance of getting into Harvard, I'll use, right? And the reality is that's just not true, right? You know, we know that there are some other factors that can really give people an advantage, like legacy status, if I'm using Harvard, right? Or things like that. And so we don't all have equal access to the opportunities and resources in order to achieve success and failure in life, right? So this one just really minimizes the role that these aspects of our identity play in our experience. A few more examples. Pathologizing cultural values or communication styles. I think this happens a lot in our society, right? Where we have this tendency to kind of think of our own experience as the norm, right? As the typical way of being or interacting. And so, you know, making comments that send that negative message about a person's behavior or approach. Okay? So this might be saying to a person with an Asian cultural background, you know, why are you so quiet? You should speak up more, right? Or saying to a person who has a cultural familial value around consulting and getting input from family members before making major decisions. We see that present in a few different cultures, some Asian cultures, some Latinx cultures, et cetera. There can be this family expectation that, let's say, before I make a major decision about my education or my career, that I'm going to consult with some of those older relatives for guidance, right? And so I always encourage my students to imagine a scenario where I'm seeing a college student, let's say, for advisement, and maybe we're talking about a major change, and they're like, well, I like what we're talking about, but I really need to consult with my parents first, right? And some of the negative assumptions that could be involved in that type of a communication, right? Oh, maybe they're too dependent on their parents. Maybe they're, you know, we really got to work on their independent decision making, right? Some of those kinds of things that might be salient from my own cultural reference points, but may not actually be an issue, right, if you will, if I consider their own cultural background and perspective. Another one we see, just to give you another example, in the counseling world, is eye contact, right? That's one of the things that we tend to expect in American culture, mainstream culture, right? That when we're interacting with someone, they make eye contact with us, that they, you know, we often interpret it as a sign of paying attention, being engaged in the conversation, being respectful, right? But in some cultures, direct eye contact can actually be seen as a sign of disrespect, particularly when you're interacting with an authority figure. And one example of that's Native American culture. So again, if I don't take the culture into consideration, I could view this behavior as a really negative thing when in fact it may reflect something other than what I'm thinking of from my own perspective. The next example is second-class citizen. This is when an individual receives different treatment from the group that's in power, in this case, in our culture, that would be white society, right? So the Grey's Anatomy clip actually gave us an example of this, where the doctor, and I'm blanking on the character's name too, I can get back to you with that, but talks about being mistaken for a nurse, right? So female doctor mistaken for a nurse. We see that happen in the opposite direction as well, right? I have heard of instances on our own campus where African-American faculty members have been asked if they're the custodian. So again, that kind of, you know, assumption based on someone's appearance of what status they hold. Okay. Traditional gender role prejudicing and stereotyping. This gets at those, you know, traditional societal gender roles for men and women primarily that we're taught and socialized to believe. So, you know, thinking that certain things are women's work or men's work, right? Associating the primary childcare responsibilities with women, perhaps making assumptions about people based on their gender expression, right? The way that they dress, the way that their haircut is, those kinds of things. Okay. Sexual objectification is when people are probably at least basically familiar, right? Treating someone as a sexual object. So that can involve things like comments, catcalling, even touching other people's bodies with that kind of sexual nature, right? And then assumption of abnormality. This one really relates a bit to the pathologizing of cultural values, but extends it even further. So an example that might fall under here is a gay couple getting kind of dirty looks in a public space holding hands, right? That can happen with interracial couples as well. It could also be involved when there can be assumptions about if someone, for example, is gay or is transgender, the assumption that something traumatic must have happened to them in their childhood, right? That's another example of this one. And then a couple more, and then I'll move away from examples. For people with disabilities, helplessness is a big microaggression, right? The assumption that people need help, they can't perform certain functions. This, of course, gets enacted in all kinds of ways, but one of the most obvious is a frequent experience who are blind. People will walk up to them and just like grab their arm and start assisting them without even introducing themselves or asking if assistance is needed. Right. Same thing happens with wheelchair users. Sometimes people will, again, with good intentions, but they'll just walk up and like start helping the person push their chair. And clearly a major invasion of personal space when those kinds of things happen. All right. Denial of personal identity occurs when some kind of aspect of our identity is denied or ignored. Like, oh, I would have never guessed we're gay, right? Or that kind of thing. Or, wow, you, I didn't realize you were married, right? I didn't realize that you had a disability. You do your work so well, right? I don't know, like those kinds of things where it's almost like cutting off that aspect of who they are. I always have trouble saying this word. I don't know what it is about this word, but I'm going to say it and you all can laugh at me if you want. Exoticization. This has to do with perceiving certain cultural groups as exotic, right? This can occur in a variety of ways. We see it sometimes with particular racial identities being seen as like enticing because of the exotic nature. Okay. We also see it when people ask kind of inappropriate probing questions about people's identities, right? So unfortunately, it's not that unusual for LGBT people to be asked like really probing questions about their sexual activities that we wouldn't ask a straight couple, right? So like a lesbian couple might get asked like, so who's the man and who's the woman in your relationship, right? Or like, how does it all work exactly? These really like inappropriate probing questions, but that somehow people feel okay to ask, right? For trans people, this can occur around their body, right? Like, oh, have you had surgery? Have you, these, again, really like invasive questions that we wouldn't ask everyone. And then finally, the assumption that one's own religion is the right one, right? Or is the normal one. And usually in our culture, that's Christianity. And this is one that we can see reflected in all kinds of ways systemically too, right? I mean, if we think about what most of our institutions' calendars are built around, it tends to be the Christian holidays, right? This is also involved when people will be coming up to this, if we haven't approached it already, are, the whole controversy about saying Merry Christmas versus Happy Holidays, and how some people are like, no, I'm only saying Merry Christmas. And, we could unpack that, of course, but I think that's one that you all may have witnessed in your personal lives. Okay, so a couple of dilemmas, students who call these, that might arise from microaggressions. And I think this is worth just noting. Is the first is that when these occur, there can really be a sharp contrast between what the players or the individuals in the situation kind of leave with, right? There's not a shared experience or a consistent experience of what has happened, right? So as I mentioned, sometimes with microaggressions, the perpetrator may not even realize that what they said has been offensive or exclusionary, right? So the two people in the situation have had a very different experience, right? One person said something, they think everything's fine, right? The other person somehow feels hurt or offended or upset, and they don't have a shared understanding of the situation, right? This can also occur in environments a lot of the time. And I'll use our institution at SUNY Brockport as an example, right? I would say we have this on our campus to some extent, in that we have a lot of students who are from more suburban and rural hometowns. And so they come to our campus and they're like, wow, this place is so diverse. There's like a lot of different types of people that I haven't really encountered yet. And I'm, interacting with more diverse people than I did in high school. Then we have a whole set of students that are from more diverse areas, right? City, Rochester, New York City, et cetera, who come to our campus and they're like, this is the whitest place I've ever been in my life, right? And so both of those realities exist on our campus at the same time, okay? And this is kind of what Sue and Sue are talking about, okay? The second dilemma that can arise, and I've alluded to this a number of times, is the invisibility of that something problematic has occurred, right? So this occurs when these microaggressions are unintentional and the person who committed them doesn't realize that they did anything wrong, okay? And so the person who's on the receiving end is left with a dilemma of what to do, right? Because the person who has said or done something problematic doesn't even realize that they've done anything wrong, okay? And I'm just going to jump down to the last one because I think these are linked. This often leads to this dilemma for the person about how do I respond, right? And Sue suggests that there are consequences no matter what the person does to a certain extent. They're between a rock and a hard place, right? It's the catch-22 situation. Because if they say something in the moment, they might have backlash, right? Particularly if the person is not open to that conversation or feels that they did nothing wrong. Okay? So interpersonal conflict could occur, right? The other option is that the person who is a victim of the microaggression may just choose to ignore it, right? To hope things are better the next time. But that also often has psychological consequences for them, right? And I'll just say for myself, like what I have learned over time personally is that it's better for me to say something or do something when I see things like this occur, because when I don't, I feel incredibly guilty and kind of beat myself up for the next several days, right? So that's that other, the result of the choice to ignore for me, okay? And then the third one that Sue and Sue identify explicitly is because these microaggressions are often, they're brief interactions, right? They're little things typically. They're a comment, they're a brief behavior, they're, an environment that doesn't feel great. They can be minimized because one microaggression is a somewhat small issue, right? However, what is very impactful is the cumulative effect of these microaggressions, right? And so what Sue say is that as a person experiences these over and over and over again, it really does lead to a significant impact in terms of their stress and perhaps even trauma, which can certainly impact their well-being, right? And so little analogy for you, we could think about it in terms of bug bites, right? You get bit by one mosquito, it's kind of annoying, right? You're a little itchy, it hurts, but it's manageable, right? You kind of go on about your day. But if you get bit by 50 mosquitoes, right, we're talking about a whole different scenario. I also just put a couple of other examples here, more explicit examples that we see, I think, very frequently in life. both in institutions and other professional organizations. One that I saw discussed at a conference once that I thought was really interesting to think about is that websites sometimes promote or that there's more diversity in the space than actually exists, right? So, you know, oftentimes, for example, on college websites, we'll see these great diverse pictures of students from all different walks of life pictured, right? But does that really represent the student body? Okay. Another one, and I'm going to show you a clip in a second, that kind of is a humorous take on that, is not learning or using people's preferred or correct names. Okay. And as I promote to my students, I believe this is a really pretty simple way to convey respect for and really uphold the dignity of people with whom we work. Right. As we saw in the first clip, asking people to represent their group or speak on behalf of their group. And I've talked to colleagues about this one in the past. I think this one is often done with really good intentions, particularly by educators, where educators are trying to invite diverse perspectives. You know, they're trying to say, like, let's hear from some of the other people in the room. But it becomes really problematic when we're asking someone to be a spokesperson for their cultural group. And then a final one on here is jokes, right? We have a number of jokes in our culture or in our society that are related to particular aspects of identity, right? And it's important to note that even when these are approached in this kind of humorous way, they can still have those negative messages and be hurtful to people. Okay. So before we move on, I'm going to stop sharing so I can share this other thing. So I'm going to show you now, and to enliven us a little bit for our further discussion, somewhat of a humorous take on the idea of not learning or using people's preferred names. So this is from Key and Peele. Are you all familiar with Key and Peele, the comedians? Okay, I'm sorry. And so this is a clip that I think is really a humorous take on this and flips the script a little bit from how we might actually see this in the real world. But I think does offer us an example of this idea of not using people's correct names. It does have a little bit of adult language, so disclaimer, although I would imagine you have probably heard these terms before at some point in your life. So I'll play this again, like I said, a humorous take on this particular dilemma, or this particular microaggression, I should say. Share sound, okay.
Speed dialing, note taking.
All right, listen. Substitute teacher, Mr. Garvey. I taught school for 20 years, so don't even think about messing with me. Y'all feel me? Okay, let's take a roll here. Jay Quellen. Where's Jay Quellen at? No Jay Quellen here? Yeah.
Do you mean Jacqueline?
Okay, so that's how it's gonna be. Y'all wanna play? Okay, then. I've got my eye on you, Jay Quellen. Balake. Where is Balake at? There's no Balake here today. Yes, sir.
My name's Blake.
Are you out of your goddamn mind? Blake? What? Do you want to go to war, Balaki?
No.
Because we could go to war.
No.
I'm for real. I'm for real. So you better check yourself. D nice. Is there a D nice? If one of y'all says some silly ass name, this whole class is gonna feel my wrath. Now, D nice.
Do you mean Denise?
Son of a bitch! You say your name right now.
Denise?
Say it right.
Denise.
Correctly.
Denise.
Right.
Denise.
Right.
D-nice.
That's better. Thank you. Now, Ron, where are you? Where is Aaron right now? No Aaron, huh? Well, you better be sick, dead, or mute, Aaron.
Here. Oh, man.
Why didn't you answer me the first time I said it, huh?
Huh?
I'm just asking, I said it like 4 times, so why didn't you say it the first time I said Aaron?
Because it's pronounced Aaron?
Son of a bitch! You done messed up, Aaron! Now take your ass on down to Oshag Hennessy's office right now and tell him exactly what you did.
Who?
Oshag Hennessy!
Principal O'Shaughnessy?
Get out of my goddamn classroom before I break my foot off in your ass! Insubordinate and churlish. Timothy.
Present.
Thank you.
So, I mean, as I mentioned, that's a pretty humorous take on this particular dilemma. But I can tell you, I've certainly observed many times over the years where students who have more complex either feel pressure to use a shortened version or kind of give up. Yelling. I can think of a student I had a few years ago who was from Eastern Europe, and his name was, is Jasmin. Yasmin was how he pronounced it, but a lot of people call him Jasmine. And he kind of got tired of correcting people, I think. And so I would frequently notice that, people were calling him by the incorrect name, and he was like, it always happens, right? But I think it's so unfortunate that people feel sometimes this pressure to use a shortened version of their name, or sometimes even adopt an American name, right? We see that sometimes with like foreign exchange students or others who have emigrated to the US.
I always tend to ask students, can you pronounce it correctly for me?
Mm-hmm.
So I know, right? Even their last name sometimes, and what you prefer to be called,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because sometimes some people like don't, even if it's an easy name to pronounce, like mine's Jeffrey, but I hate Jeffrey, so please call me Jeff. Like, it's so you ask that from students. I had a student this semester who I had last year, whose name is Rafka. She's from Lebanon. And although she's an American-born citizen, but her parents are from Lebanon. But I had her in class last year. So the first class I had her in this semester, I said, "Oh, hi, Rock." She goes, "I go by Becca now." So I didn't know that. I mean, I said, "Okay, great to see you, Becca." Because I didn't know that she wanted to be called that. I mean, I called her by her given name because that's what's on my roll. And we've even asked at the university and to get our systems updated. I haven't had a transgender student in one of my classes, but if I do, and they're, were Robert and they want to be called Roberta, for example, now, I wouldn't know that. I'm only going to see what's in front of me. So it's important, right, that I address them in the way that they prefer to be addressed by the proper name, to your point. And so if as we have transgender students, and they're transitioning and they want to take on the name that they're transitioning to, if they're going from male to female, or even if they're non-binary, whatever how they identify, it's important to respect that. But again, we have to have the tools as educators too,
right?
To be able to do that correctly.
Yeah, 100%. And we went through some of that at Brockport, certainly too, in terms of getting the systems to allow for a correct name to be on the roster, because I'm also aware that we had, by and large, I think our faculty were taking a similar approach, Jeff, and we're really trying to get students, to give us that information. But unfortunately, I know of a couple of instances where people were like, I'm going to call you by the name on the roster. And so, yeah, those systemic changes can make a big difference. But my approach to this tends to be to do some kind of activity that first day where students have to introduce themselves. And just to your point, it's not always just people from a particular, ethnic, racial group or gender identity. Oftentimes I find out, people want to go, like I go by Jess usually, right? Or they'll tell me, they go by a shortened version of their name or a nickname or some other thing. And that as well, I think makes a big difference. When you were talking, I was thinking of another student I had several years ago whose first name was Christina, but it was Tina, right? And if I had called her Christina the entire semester, I would not have been her favorite person, certainly. And I think these are simple things that we can do to really uphold people's dignity and convey our respect for them, by just using their current name. I'm not going to share the PowerPoint again. I have some other things in there, but I'm sensitive to the time. And so I just want to mention, I have another slide in there. Like I said, I'm happy to share the PowerPoint that has some other examples, like from students that are holding up signs. And I also included a few tips, if you will, about how things, you know, some strategies for fostering diversity and inclusion that are a little more explicit. But I don't know if people have a couple more minutes, but I guess I would just like to, at this point, since I know we're running out of time, open the floor for any questions or any other examples of these microaggressions that you've observed or you think are relevant in your own spaces.
I think most students are pretty open. Like we'll talk about this in the concept of what they are in my HR class when I talk about diversity, equity, inclusion. And most students will joke and say, so like if I have an African-American student, so you're going to bring me watermelon, right? And they do it in the context of joking. And I said, well, I have many friends that are African-American that actually don't like watermelon, right? So it's that, so we try to do it in a way that's, you know, fun and engaging and joking, that, you know, you have to realize that not every person, you know, because that's a microaggression. You know, I brought you watermelon because, you know, you're Black and you must like watermelon or fried chicken, whatever. And so I try to do it, but it is hard sometimes. And I found myself making that mistake where, like, we're talking about something, you know, we might talk about like ethnic cuisine, and I have a student who's from Lebanon, and I kind of want her to talk about it, but then I don't want to call her out and represent her group. So it's, you know, doing it in a way that doesn't call people out, but that gets people to, because sometimes some of our students are very, what's the best word, are very limited in their exposure. Some students come from very homogenous environments and high schools and are not as exposed to other cultures, right? And so the whole point of education in college is to learn that, to get exposed to different beliefs, different cultures, you know, and that's what the classroom environment should be, is a safe place to talk about different beliefs and different cultures and different viewpoints, etc., without, you know, as long as we're not offending anybody.
Yeah, I think that's super important, and to kind of make space for those mistakes, right? Because, you know, these are things that we're taught, right? From like the time we're little kids, we're socialized through, you know, certainly our families, but also through media, through schools, through, you know, all kinds of things. And we learn these stereotypes and these assumptions like through no fault of our own, right? And so what I try to encourage people to think about is like try not to sit in guilt, right? If you recognize that you have maybe, you know, done or said some of these things in the past, you know, it's because of the things you were taught and have experienced thus far. But now you have an opportunity to you know, change some of these things now that you recognize that maybe they're not the best approach, or they might be potentially offensive or exclusionary to certain people. Because I think, I don't know about you, Jeff, but sometimes my students get a little caught up in that. It's like, oh gosh, I've said that, you know, I've said like, I don't see color, or, you know, that kind of thing. And so I really try to encourage people to think about the next, you know, okay, now you know, so then how can you use this newfound knowledge going
We actually
forward?
have, no, you're right. We actually have a video that says we're all Widener, and it talks about, you know, you're invalidating someone's culture if you say, I don't see color, I don't see gender, you know, that a woman goes through different experiences than a man. Someone who's African-American may go different experiences than someone who's Latinx or Asian or, you know, whatever. And not every student that looks Asian was born in, you know, an Asian country. They might be very much born in the United States, you know, and very enculturated into the United States. And so, you know, but I've also found, we used to have a master's program in hospitality, and it was predominantly students from Saudi Arabia. But I found that our international students love when you do embrace their culture. Like we would, you know, tell me about some of the things that you like to eat. And I taught a group of students, was a summer class, and it happened to be Ramadan. And of course they can't eat, they fast. And so at the end of the class, it was at night, it was starting to get dark, and they'd bring Arabic coffee in, and dates. And that's how they started their night. Like, will you stay with us and have coffee and talk and dates? I'm like, sure. And then they would go out and eat like crazy, right? Because that's the only time they could eat until the next day. They also would say, look, is there a time where we could pray? And so recognizing, okay, I'll break at this time. I'll find a place for you to go, and you can go pray during that time, so that, you get to do what's important to you, and we can still run the class effectively.
Yeah, that's great. I bet that was beneficial to all the students too, not just those students that
No, it
had those
is.
practices.
And the students get like, my Asian students bring in sometimes it's, Chinese New Year, and I brought you this to taste, it's traditional. I'm like, great, let me taste it. I love it. And they get excited, and I get excited. I think it's a really cool thing because we're learning from each other.
Yeah, that's very great. I really love this discussion. I feel like we can go another hour, but so maybe Jess will invite you back next year, so then we can have more discussion. So
absolutely.
One thing to think about, and Jen, maybe this is something we could do at the conference this spring, because this is so beneficial to a lot of the educators. So maybe if Jess is able to, we can do this, think about something this at our NENA conference this spring.
Yeah, I think that would be great, because I'm sure, even that open discussion would be beneficial to everyone, being able to recognize and share examples and really kind of drill down. Absolutely.
Yeah, I'd certainly be open to that if I'm available. As I said to Yaling, this is one of my favorite topics to talk about and teach, because I think it's just so relevant to our lives and to our experiences. Like, anyone can apply this in whatever, area they're working in or living in, because they're just apparent in everything we do.
And I think it's important to send a message, even to faculty, it's okay to make mistakes. Like, it's not a horrible thing, as long as you're learning from it. We're all learning and still improving, right? And it's okay as long as you recognize it and you move forward and you try to do better. I think that's the important thing.
Exactly. So that's I want to be respectful for everybody's time. So thank you so much, Jess, for joining us today. And I'm on behalf of NENA, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for being here, all of you,
Thank
on a
you,
Friday.
Jess.
I know. Yes. And
Thank
I'll send
you.
Yaling the PowerPoint, and you can feel free to share with the group.
That would
No
be
problem.
wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jess.
Thanks
We
so
appreciate
much.
it.
Thank you,
Wonderful talk.
everyone.
Thank you. Thanks.
Bye.
Have a nice
Have
weekend.
a good holiday.
You too.